the 9th. The Saarland Hitler Youth shattered windows of about 7,500 Jewish stores and businesses, hence the name Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, and looted the goods. 46 Jewish homes were ransacked all throughout Germany. Although violence against Jews had not been explicitly condoned by the authorities, there were cases of Jews being beaten or assaulted. Following the violence, police departments recorded a large number of suicides and rapes. 6. The rioters destroyed 267 synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. 6. Over 1,400 synagogues and prayer rooms, 41. Many Jewish cemeteries, more than 7,000 Jewish shops, and 29 department stores were damaged, and in many cases destroyed. More than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, primarily Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. 42. The synagogues, some centuries old, were also victims of considerable violence and vandalism, with the tactics the stormtroopers practiced on these and other sacred sites described as approaching the Gaulish by the United States consul in Leipzig. Tombstones were uprooted and graves violated. Fires were lit, and prayer books, scrolls, artwork and philosophy texts were thrown upon them, and precious buildings were either burned or smashed until unrecognizable. Eric Lucas recalls the destruction of the synagogue that a tiny Jewish community had constructed in a small village only 12 years earlier. It did not take long before the first heavy grey stones came tumbling down, and the children of the village amused themselves as they flung stones into the many-colored windows. When the first rays of a cold and pale November sun penetrated the heavy dark clouds, the little synagogue was but a heap of stone, broken glass and smashed up woodwork. 43. The Daily Telegraph correspondent, Hugh Green, wrote of events in Berlin. Mob law ruled in Berlin throughout the afternoon and evening, and hordes of hooligans indulged in an orgy of destruction. I have seen several anti-Jewish outbreaks in Germany during the last 5 years, but never anything as nauseating as this. Racial hatred and hysteria seemed to have taken complete hold of otherwise decent people. I saw fashionably dressed women clapping their hands and screaming with glee, while respectable middle-class mothers shelled up their babies to see the fun. 44. Many Berliners were, however, deeply ashamed of the pogrom, and some took great personal risks to offer help to their beleaguered Jewish neighbors. The son of a U.S. consular official heard the janitor of his block cry, "They must have emptied the insane asylums and penitentiaries to find people who'd do things like that." 45. Cod briefly reported on a 2008 remembrance meeting at a local Jewish congregation. According to eyewitness Esther Harris, they ripped up the belongings, the books, knocked over furniture, shouted obscenities. 46. Historian Gerhard Weinberg is quoted as saying houses of worship burned down, vandalized, in every community in the country where people either participate or watch. 46. Aftermath. A ruined synagogue in Munich after Kristallnacht. A ruined synagogue in Eisenach after Kristallnacht. Former German Kaiser Wilhelm II commented for the first time, "I am ashamed to be German." 47. Göring, who was in favor of expropriating the property of the Jews rather than destroying it as had happened in the pogrom, directly complained to Sicherheitspolizei Chief Heydrich immediately after the events, "I'd rather you had done in 200 Jews than destroy so many valuable assets. Mir wär lieber Jewesen, ihr hattet 200 Judine schlagen und hattet nicht solch Wort vernichtet." 48. Göring met with other members of the Nazi leadership on 12 November to plan the next steps after the riot, setting the stage for formal government action. In the transcript of the meeting, Göring said, "I have received a letter written on the Pharaoh's orders requesting that the Jewish question be now, once and for all, coordinated and solved one way or another." I should not want to leave any doubt, gentlemen, as to the aim of today's meeting. We have not come together merely to talk again, but to make decisions, and I implore competent agencies to take all measures for the economy, and to submit them to me. 49. The persecution and economic damage inflicted upon German Jews continued after the pogrom, even as the places of business were ransacked. They were forced to pay Judenvermögensabgabe, a collective fine or atonement contribution of 1 billion Reichsmarks for the murder of Van Rath, equivalent to €4,000,2021 or 7 billion in 2020 USD, which was levied by the compulsory acquisition of 20% of all Jewish property by the state. 6 million Reichsmarks of insurance payments for property damage due to the Jewish community were instead paid to the Reich government as damages to the German nation. Jews were required to pay for the cost of all damages caused by the pogrom to their residences and businesses. 50, 51, 52. The number of emigrating Jews surged, as those who were able to left the country. In the 10 months following Kristallnacht, more than 115,000 Jews emigrated from the Reich. 53. The majority went to other European countries, the United States or Mandatory Palestine, though at least 14,000 made it to Shanghai, China. As part of government policy, the Nazis seized houses, shops, and other property the émigrés left behind. Many of the destroyed remains of Jewish property plundered during Kristallnacht were dumped near Brandenburg. In October 2008, this dump site was discovered by Yaron Svory, an investigative journalist. The site, the size of 4 football fields, contained an extensive array of personal and ceremonial items looted during the riots against Jewish property and places of worship on the night of 9 November 1938. It is believed the goods were brought by rail to the outskirts of the village and dumped on designated land. Among the items found were glass bottles engraved with the Star of David, mezuzot, painted windowsills, and the armrests of chairs found in synagogues, in addition to an ornamental swastika. 54. Responses to Kristallnacht. In Germany, the reaction of non-Jewish Germans to Kristallnacht was varied. Many spectators gathered on the scenes, most of them in silence. The local fire departments confined themselves to prevent the flames from spreading to neighboring buildings. In Berlin, Police Lieutenant Otto Belgard barred troopers from setting the new synagogue on fire, earning his superior officer a verbal reprimand from the commissioner. 55. The British historian Martin Gilbert believes that many non-Jews resented the roundup. 56. His opinion being supported by German witness Dr. Arthur Fleihinger, who recalls seeing people crying while watching from behind their curtains. 57. Rolf Dessauers recalls how a neighbor came forward and restored a portrait of Paul Ehrlich that had been slashed to ribbons by the Sturmabteilung. He wanted it to be known that not all Germans supported Kristallnacht. 58. The extent of the damage done on Kristallnacht was so great that many Germans are said to have expressed the disapproval of it, and to have described it as senseless. 59. There was however no personal comment or even acknowledgement from the German leader Adolf Hitler himself about Kristallnacht. 60. In an article released for publication on the evening of the 11th of November, Goebbels ascribed the events of Kristallnacht to the healthy instincts of the German people. He went on to explain, the German people are anti-Semitic. It has no desire to have its rights restricted or to be provoked in the future by parasites of Jewish race. 61. Less than 24 hours after Kristallnacht, Adolf Hitler made a 1-hour-long speech in front of a group of journalists where he completely ignored the recent events on everyone's mind. Portrait of Paul Ehrlich damaged on Kristallnacht, then restored by a German neighbor. According to Eugene Davidson, the reason for this was that Hitler wished to avoid being directly connected to an event that he was aware that many of those present condemned, regardless of Goebbels's unconvincing explanation that Kristallnacht was caused by popular wrath. 60. Goebbels met the foreign press in the afternoon of the 11th of November and said that the burning of synagogues and damage to Jewish-owned property had been spontaneous manifestations of indignation against the murder of Herr von Rath by the young Jew Grinspan. 62. In 1938, just after Kristallnacht, the psychologist Michael Muller-Claudius interviewed 41 randomly selected Nazi Party members on their attitudes towards racial persecution. Of the interviewed party members, 63% expressed extreme indignation against it, while only 5% expressed approval of racial persecution, the rest being non-committal. 63. A study conducted in 1933 had then shown that 33% of Nazi Party members held no racial prejudice while 13% supported persecution. Sarah Ann Gorder sees two possible reasons for this difference. First, by 1938 large numbers of Germans had joined the Nazi Party for pragmatic reasons rather than ideology, thus diluting the percentage of rabid antisemites. Second, the Kristallnacht could have caused party members to reject antisemitism that had been acceptable to them in abstract terms but which they could not support when they saw it concretely enacted. 64. During the events of Kristallnacht, several Gauleiter and deputy Gauleiters had refused orders to enact the Kristallnacht, and many leaders of the SA and of the Hitler Youth also openly refused party orders, while expressing disgust. 65. Some Nazis helped Jews during the Kristallnacht. 65. After 1945 some synagogues were arrested. This one in Berlin features a plaque, reading "Never Forget," a common expression around Berlin as it was aware that the German public did not support the Kristallnacht. The propaganda ministry directed the German press to portray opponents of racial persecution as disloyal. 66. The press was also under orders to downplay the Kristallnacht, describing general events at the local level only, with prohibition against depictions of individual events. 67. In 1939 this was extended to a prohibition on reporting any anti-Jewish measures. 68. The U.S. ambassador to Germany reported, in view of this being a totalitarian state, a surprising characteristic of the situation here is the intense and scope among German citizens of condemnation of the recent happenings against Jews. 69. To the consternation of the Nazis, the Kristallnacht affected public opinion counter to their desires. The peak of opposition against the Nazi racial policies was reached just then, when according to almost all accounts the vast majority of Germans rejected the violence perpetrated against the Jews. 70. Verbal complaints grew rapidly in numbers, and for example, the Dusseldorf branch of the Gestapo reported a sharp decline in anti-Semitic attitudes among the population. 71. There are many indications of Protestant and Catholic disapproval of racial persecution. For example, anti-Nazi Protestants adopted the Barmen Declaration in 1934, and the Catholic Church had already distributed pastoral letters critical of Nazi racial ideology, and the Nazi regime expected to encounter organized assistance from it following Kristallnacht. 72. The Catholic leadership, however, just as the various Protestant churches, refrained from responding with organized action. 72. Martin Sass, Nazi Party member and Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Thuringia, leading member of the Nazi German Christians, one of the schismatic factions of German Protestantism, published a compendium of Martin Luther's writings shortly after the Kristallnacht. Sass applauded the burning of synagogues and the coincidence of the day, writing in the introduction, on the 10th of November, 1938, on Luther's birthday, the synagogues are burning in Germany. The German people, he urged, ought to heed his words of the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the warner of his people against the Jews. 73. Diarmaid MacCulloch argued that Luther's 1543 pamphlet, on the Jews and their lies was a blueprint for the Kristallnacht. 74. Internationally. British Jews protest against immigration restrictions to Palestine after Kristallnacht. November 1938. Kristallnacht sparked international outrage. According to Volker Ulrich, a line had been crossed. Germany had left the community of civilized nations. 75. It discredited pro-Nazi movements in Europe and North America, leading to a sharp decline in their support. Many newspapers condemned Kristallnacht, with some of them comparing it to the murderous pogroms incited by Imperial Russia during the 1880s. The United States recalled its ambassador, but it did not break off diplomatic relations, while other governments severed diplomatic relations with Germany in protest. The British government approved the Kinder Transport program for refugee children. Kristallnacht marked a turning point in relations between Nazi Germany and the rest of the world. The brutality of the pogrom and the Nazi government's deliberate policy of encouraging the violence once it had begun, laid bare the repressive nature and widespread antisemitism entrenched in Germany. World opinion thus turned sharply against the Nazi regime, with some politicians scowling for war. On the 6th of December, 1938, William Cooper, an Aboriginal Australian, led a delegation of the Australian Aboriginal League on a march through Melbourne to the German consulate to deliver a petition which condemned the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany. German officials refused to accept the tendered document. 76. After the Kristallnacht, Salvador Allende, Gabriel González Videla, Marmaduke Grove, Florencio Duran and other members of the Congress of Chile sent a telegram to Adolf Hitler denouncing the persecution of Jews. 77. A more personal response, in 1939, was the oratorio A Child of Our Time by the English composer Michael Tippett. 78. Post-war trials. After the end of World War II, there were hundreds of trials over Kristallnacht. The trials were conducted exclusively by German and Austrian courts. The Allied occupation authorities did not have jurisdiction since none of the victims were Allied nationals. 79. Kristallnacht as a turning point. Kristallnacht changed the nature of Nazi Germany's persecution of the Jews from economic, political, and social exclusion to physical violence, including beatings, incarceration, and murder. The event is often referred to as the beginning of the Holocaust. In this view, it is not only described as a pogrom, it is also described as a critical stage within a process in which each step becomes the seed of the next step. 80. An account cited that Hitler's green light for Kristallnacht was made with the belief that it would help him realize his ambition of getting rid of the Jews in Germany. 80. Prior to this large-scale and organized violence against the Jews, the Nazis' primary objective was to eject them from Germany, leaving their wealth behind. 80. In the words of historian Max Rain in 1988, Kristallnacht came, and everything was changed. 81. While November 1938 predated the overt articulation of the final solution, it foreshadowed the genocide to come. Around the time of Kristallnacht, the SS newspaper Das Schwarze called for a destruction by swords and flames. At a conference on the day after the pogrom, Hermann Göring said, "The Jewish problem will reach its solution if, in any time soon, we will be drawn into war beyond our border, then it is obvious that we will have to manage a final account with the Jews." 16. Kristallnacht was also instrumental in changing global public opinion. In the United States, for instance, it was this specific incident which came to symbolize Nazism, and it was also the reason as to why the Nazis became associated with evil. 82. Modern references. 5 decades later, 9 November's association with the anniversary of Kristallnacht was cited as the main reason as to why Schicksalstag, the day the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, was not turned into an